Welcome, Jai Jagat, to everybody to the lecture series on nonviolent governance, the case of the Armenian Revolution. Today we have the third in our series, and it's entitled Role of Civil Society in Nonviolent Political Change. As discussants today, we have two very, very interesting panelists. One is our Isabella Sarkisian, who works at Eurasia Partnership here in Armenia and has a long history of working in civil society. And we also have our own coordinator of the Jai Jagat March, Raj Gopal from India, who is well known to many as a activist, a nonviolent peace activist for many years from India, but has been leading a global march across India, Iran, and Armenia. Unfortunately, it was cut short because of the coronavirus. So I want to also welcome my co-host, David Petrosin, who is the director of START in Armenia, a youth organization that has been very, very important in the nonviolent revolution in Armenia, and in the sense of bringing together thousands of young people from around the country to support and continue the project of this new Armenia. So welcome to our panelists, my co-host, and to all the viewers that have come today. I'm going to turn it over to David now, to my co-host, to further introduce today's session. David?
Hello, dear friends. Thank you, Jill, for a good introduction. As Jill has already mentioned, today we are going to speak about the role of civil society in nonviolent political change, and we are going to go more deeply into Armenian case, Armenian Velvet Revolution case. As we know, the role of civil society was really very important during the revolution. So, as we know, civil societies are considered to be one of the pillars of democracies. And as now Armenia is in democratization process, the role of civil society is very important in terms of supporting this process. At the same time, Armenian Revolution is considered as a successful experience, successful phenomenon, and a lot of countries are interested in it and want also to know about Armenian civil society, how it came, where its roots are, what difficulties it met before the revolution, how it participated in the revolution, and what challenges currently it faces after the revolution. So I think we can already give the floor to our speakers, who I'm sure have a lot to say, and I think we are going to have a good discussion, and people who watch us, I ask you to be active. You can write your questions, and we will do everything to answer to that questions.
Maybe then, David, we can ask Isabella, or Bela, as she's known as, to begin with an opening statement.
First of all, thank you very, very much for having me today. It's a big honor. I should tell a very brief story how I learned about Jai Jagat. It happened much earlier than the march arrived to Armenia, or even preparation came to Armenia, because I was in Paris about 2 years ago, where I met my very old friend Bernard Riano, who is one of the activists engaged in it. So he told me this fantastic story of people decided to march from India to Geneva, and he said sooner or later they are going to be somewhere around in your region, so keep your eye on it. And then pretty soon I learned that some of my best friends are from Georgia, like Irakli, and from Armenia, Arsen and David are engaged in it. So it shows how small actually the world is. something that we feel now, days of this pandemic, that in fact is very fragile and very small, both in good way and bad way. So this is my personal kind of introduction to this great march and great story and great nonviolent movement. I should say that Armenian Revolution, Velvet Revolution as we call it, has very strong links, in fact, with Mahatma Gandhi and Will Salt March, because I believe that many of the leaders, not necessarily only political leaders, but also civic leaders around the movement, were very much impressed by it. And I think it was many times, I think David can also speak about it, but it was heard, it was made public that we should not give up and we should try again in this nonviolent way. So I think this influence goes globally. I think this quote from Gandhi that first they laugh at you and they and then in the end you win, I think it was one of the slogans that we could see during the revolution. Coming back to David's question, in fact, it's huge. What the civil society in Armenia is. I can maybe flag several things and then we can discuss it further. First of all, I don't think that definition of civil society is narrow, as some people try to narrow it down to civil society organizations or NGOs. I believe that civil society is organized citizens who do not pursue their own or their family goals or support their own causes, but they organized citizens who try to support all sorts of public causes and try to keep government accountable in one way or another. And the history of organized citizens, as I believe in India and many other places, if we get rid of this very narrow definition of civil society as NGOs, which is very much Western idea, it goes back at least to Ottoman Empire, where Armenians used to live for decades and where actually even ethnogenesis of Armenian nation took place. And since Armenian people were divided between Ottoman Empire and in certain period of time also Russian Empire, we could see these organizations or organized civil society around different causes, starting in big cities, not only Istanbul, but also places like Van in Turkey, some other Armenian populated areas. Same with Russia. They were also, I'm speaking about 19th century, lots of clubs, benevolent organizations, charity organizations. And for instance, one of the biggest Armenian diaspora, but also now Armenia-based organizations, AGBU, it started in Egypt as a charity organization helping Armenian people in Ottoman Empire. So I can't go a lot about it, but this is just to say that this is a wrong perception that civil society in Armenia started just in 90s or with the beginning of independence. In fact, if you look and take broader definition of civil society, it was there at least by the end of 18th, beginning of 19th century in very different forms: educational, sports clubs, women clubs, charity clubs. It was a lot. And then after the genocide, where Armenians had to flee the Ottoman Empire, lots of it was developing also in Armenian diaspora. The different type of organizations around churches, not necessarily churches, some political parties that we used to have since 19th century. This is just to give you one definition. And then another definition, which is also now developed in different scholarship and different academic circles, is that in fact, in this part of the world, for example, there are other forms of civil society which were never recognized as such. It is just society networks of mutual help, for example. So I give you an example of Gerarkonik region, which it's very common practice that when someone dies, usually the whole village collects money for the costs of the funeral, of the food, and etc. And then they write down which family donated how much money for that particular family. And then when in a village someone else dies, then exactly they take out the list and they look into who donated. And then it goes like a circle from family to family. It's also true when, for example, young people go to army, and how the things, this network of citizens is organized. So if we take a larger view on it, I believe that Armenia did have a very good civil society network even before the independence, and then after the independence, and also during Soviet times. Of course, there were lots of formal civil society organizations such as writers' unions or teachers' unions, I don't know, trade unions, which were not real. But at the same time, there were also real organizations, including, this might be an interesting case for you, some organizations of repatriants. So in 40s and then in 60s, there were two waves of repatriation. Armenian refugees who had to flee to Middle East, for example, or Europe, or even United States after the genocide, they were invited by Soviet government to repatriate to Armenia. So many of them repatriated, and they brought a lot of their native culture, including some clubs, which are called Հայրենակցական միություններ, or compatriot clubs, into Armenia. And until now, for example, you have Musaler celebrations of people who flee from Musaler, and then some people who came from Syria, and there is a village where the celebrations are taking place every year. There are, until today, Van Vaspurakan, for example, a union of people who had to flee Van and Vaspurakan area in Ottoman Empire. So I'm telling all this maybe a little bit unknown or untold stories, because I believe that we should take a broader look on what in fact civil society is, and there is little scholarship about such things in Armenia. As of post-Soviet period, I should say that civil society developed pretty quickly. It started with humanitarian aid, because, as you know, in 1988, a terrible earthquake happened in Spitak, where about 25,000 people killed because of the earthquake. And then lots of humanitarian aid started to arrive. It was still Soviet Union, but of course it was a devastating earthquake. So for years to come, different organizations like Austrian Red Cross, German Red Cross, Italians started to help to rebuild the area. And then the charity organizations started. That was one of the kickstarts. Then a bit later, peace organizations or groups like Helsinki Citizens Assembly started to operate, because there was a war with Azerbaijan, and then starting, I think, around 93, 94, the ceasefire was achieved in 94. There were groups from Azerbaijan and Armenia who started some sort of peer-to-peer talks, and even managed to exchange hostages, to have peace meetings in the border, in Kazakh and Ijevan, for example. It was in the middle of the war, it was possible. So we had some peace movement starting already in the middle of the war and after the war, that continued. Then we had also human rights organizations created and boosting in Armenia little by little. Then, in certain point in time, we also witnessed very strong public movements. And as we calculated, it was 1988 when we had all Armenian movement, also about Karabakh case, but also independence movement. Then in 2008, like 20 years, again 8, we had rigged the elections, and there was a big movement protesting against it. When a very sad story, when 10 protesters were killed, peaceful protesters, 8 protesters, 1 policeman and 1 military person were killed after the protests, and we had state of emergency. It was 2008, and then 2018, again 8, we had the Velvet Revolution. So in each of that, we had huge public mobilization and public protests, and all of them were peaceful, in non-violent in their essence. And if you read newspaper articles from 1988 of Soviet Union in Russian, I think lots of Russian intellectuals were very supportive of Armenian movement just because it was so peaceful. And it was so unusually huge, but then in Yerevan you couldn't see any broken window or tree or anything. So I believe this sort of political culture was in Armenia at least since 2000, at least 1988. In between of that, we also had development of movements. So we had different type of movements. We had environmental movement, we had movement for city heritage preservation and green areas such as Marstos Park. We had movement pretty strong against hike of electricity prices. So also together with informal civil society, formal civil society, we also had development of different movements, social movements, political movements, civic movements. And I believe that the revolution of 2018 was a culmination, was a paramount of all that big and small movements, also failures, also unsuccessful attempts and lessons learned that all came together in certain point in time, and that's how the revolution happened. I can go and go, so I probably stop here, and then we can come back because it's a huge piece of kind of huge question, and so it's very difficult to answer it all.
Thank you, Bella, for this.
You're muted.
Big introduction. It was really very interesting to listen this story, this long story. It goes back to 17th, 18th century even. I can just add and like to add some small remarks that, for example, our group in Madras in India was also very powerful in terms of thinking like democratically about changes political that Armenia needs. And Shamil Shah Amirian even wrote a type of constitution, and it is even older than the Declaration of Independence of America, United States of America, French Declaration of Rights and Liberties. So for our international friends, just to know that Armenians were in India as well, and they were working quite intensively to help their compatriots who were living under the power of Ottoman and Iranian power. And I think we can give the floor Rajaji to represent the role maybe of civil society outside of Armenia, and especially in terms of non-violent change.
Thank you. Thank you.
With your experience.
Thank you, David. First of all, thanks to Bella for this beautiful presentation of giving this large picture of how the civil society is working in this part of the region. And I'm very happy today that we are doing an Armenia-focused discussion. And I'm sure our viewers will be very happy to know more about this revolution in Armenia. Because every time I came to Armenia, I had the opportunity to meet many civil society actors. And so it was very, very pleasing to our mind to see this non-violent revolution, you know, how it was unfolding, this many civil society organizations coming together, articulating an agenda, and finally a non-violent revolution where you were able to bring about a new state and new players. And it is also interesting to see many civil society actors are now in the government. They play a very important role within the government. And I understand that you continue to pursue many of this important agenda related to people, very ordinary people, poor people, and to try to see how this newly elected government, with the help of civil society, can answer many of those issues that you are fighting for the last many years. So we are very proud that you have organized this revolution in a non-violent way. We are very proud that there are many actors from the civil society in the government. Because, like Gandhi said, if you achieve something through brute force, you will try to keep it through brute force. And if you achieve something with soul force, you will try to keep it with soul force. So a non-violent victory is like achieving something through soul force. So I'll be very happy to know more about how do we pursue this achievement. This is one step that people have brought about a change in the system. Now, a non-violent revolution bringing about a government. Now, how do we move forward in terms of changing the system so that the whole system becomes non-violent? And that is where some examples from India will be of some interest. See, we had this huge freedom struggle under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, the non-violent movement. That you mentioned one of them, the salt satyagraha, was part of that large movement. And Gandhi stopped the movement whenever the movement became violent. So he was very, very, very careful that he said, I don't want a freedom through violence, because then you will continue to use violence to keep that freedom. So he wanted a freedom through non-violence so that we will continue to use non-violence as a method to keep the freedom. And his focus was on the poor people, the poorest people in the society, because he kept on saying that the freedom should ultimately address the problems of the poorest section of the society, the poor man and poor women in the society. And then we had a big civil society movement led by Vinoba Bhave, the disciple of Mahatma Gandhi. Thousands of people marching through India for years and years, because they thought freedom in terms of state, formation of a new state, is not going to bring about anything big. The freedom should be for the masses at the bottom. And they cannot be free unless they have control over land and resources. If the livelihood resources are not in their control, the land is not in their control, it is in the control of the rich people, then what is freedom for them? So the long movement, 14 years, Vinoba Bhave, the disciple of Mahatma Gandhi, walked through the country called India, and he brought about a revolution in terms of land reforms. He said, look, if we don't give land to the poor people, people will come with gun and take the land away. So why should we wait for people to come with gun and take the land away? Why don't we give it voluntarily? So he was able to collect 4.2 million acres of land and then introduce a land reform, what we call the people-led land reform, which then state accepted that reform, and they also try to legislate many laws that will support that land reform, but then we didn't go very, very far. Then we had a third movement led by a person called Jayaprakash Narayan. And there again, the idea was once we will win this fight, win this struggle, then we will work for the poor people. What I'm trying to say, here realize that, look, whether it is a movement led by Gandhi, movement led by Vinoba, his disciple, then JP, his disciple, the idea of reaching out to the poorest person in the society is not happening, right? The focus of Gandhi was the poorest. Focus of Gandhi was the rural areas, because he said, unless the villages are self-sufficient and self-governed, the state being free from British people is not going to make much difference. So how do we, so for Indians, for Armenians, the very important question now will be, how do we take this non-violent revolution and transform it in a way that it can bring result to the last person in the society. It can also bring about transformation the way we construct our economy, we construct our developmental programs, we construct our educational programs, everything need to transform. So it will be very interesting to know, the last 2 years, all of you have worked very hard to make this revolution bring real fruits for the ordinary people. So I'll be happy if we can take this discussion further and see how revolutions can really bring about result in the life of the ordinary people, the marginalized people, the poorest people of the society. Okay?
Thank you very much. I think it's very interesting to listen about India and about waves of non-violent resistance, let's put it that way. I'm just thinking that India and Armenia, it's very difficult to compare, because you said how many millions of land, which is something, a fantastic figure, because Armenia is only 29,000 square kilometers, and it's only 3.2 million around it. So I think it's smaller than one of big cities in India. So also Armenia, I don't know, it has its advantages and disadvantages, but it's pretty homogeneous country. You can't really compare with India, which is multinational, multi-religious, multi-caste, totally different type of civilization. I even wouldn't say culture, but civilization with very different history of colonization and decolonization. Armenia, what was done in 90s, Armenia had one of the best and successful land reforms in post-Soviet countries, because first thing that the government, which came to power in 91 did, there was a privatization of land immediately. So everyone got land, because prior to that, there were so-called collective farms, Soviet-type collective farms, that the land reform was very quick, with all its problems, of course, something that countries like Ukraine, because of the scale, couldn't do until today. They are still working on land reform. So in Armenia, everyone has a land, each single small or big farmer. So now, of course, with there is this amalgamation problems, there are new feudals coming in, but this is a different process, because in the beginning, everyone got a land. And this quick land reform also saved us from famine, because in 90s we had this blockage and we had war, when in fact village and the farmers, small farmers who could produce something and sell it to the city, helped people living in cities a lot. So with land reform, it was pretty quick. Also, I believe if we come to revolution, this is my personal opinion, I'd like to hear maybe David and others. I think as any big event, a revolution, it on one hand, everyone predicted that the old regime has no resources, it has to fall down or fall apart later, but no one could really say that it will happen now. I think it was a combination, or it was some sort of different factors coming together. I wouldn't really say it was thanks to the civil society or it was thanks to the political party who led it. It was thanks to this. It was really combination, and to me, very irrational combination of many factors. Also of mistakes done by the previous Prime Minister Sir Sarkisian, by small mistakes then in other circumstances wouldn't work like that, but mistakes and successes and strategy and decentralized protest and civil society, it all came together, I believe in certain very irrational way that you can't really repeat in other circumstances when you don't have your stars coming together in that particular way. And if you look into the collapse of Soviet Union, it happened exactly like that. That the Politburo, the leadership of Soviet Union took several wrong decisions. They had a terrible press conference where they were drunk. Same with the Sersak. And then in a very unexpected way, things worked out. So I take credit for Armenian people, for political leadership, for the civil society, for many things, but I believe there's always something irrational around it. So if I go further for past 2 years, I think it's times of hopes, of big expectations, of I wouldn't even say exaggerated expectations from ourselves, from our government, but also a learning curve, a learning process. As a bit of research or academia person, I think that transformation never happens quick. I look into our neighbors, countries like Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, who went through sort of changes once, in some cases twice. It takes a lot of time, and here where civil society is crucial, because even the best government, the best people, our friends, our personal friends, people we grew up together, we went to university together, we were in school together, we were on streets together, and now some of them decided to go to the government. Some of us decided to stay in the civil society. Some people decided to go for business. It's fine, it's just life. But we should somehow find out how to balance our relations and how to balance power relations, because at the end of the day, it's not the government which should be, how to say it correctly, it's not about people who is in charge. It's not about who is there, my friend or someone else. It's about nature of power, which has this tendency of centralization, of control, of not necessarily physical, but use of some sort of press and violence. So I think at this certain point in time, it's extremely, extremely important for us as civil society to be able to find out right language, right issues, right tone, how we keep going to watchdog our government. On one hand, how we can support, where we can support, but on the other hand, how we can articulate our concerns, how we can lift all the concerns you were talking about, poverty, I think we have about 30+% of people living in poverty in this country, not because they don't have land, but because of many other structural and all different type of causes. How we also change the perception of poverty, which is also very, very important. How we find out, which is a key issue for me personally, how we resolve conflicts with other neighbors, because we are landlocked country with close border with Turkey and front line with Azerbaijan, how we are going to develop as a nation, as a country, as economy, because lots of problems that we do have, in fact, their roots are very deep and are in conflict, because as long as you have an opponent, let's put it that way, if not an enemy, the whole public discourse, the thinking it's going to be very militarized, it's going to be very nationalist, it's going to be focused on us and them, to a very, very strong degree. So to me, both from my political convictions and my citizen convictions, I believe that making peace with neighbors is a key issue for development, for being part of the world, for economy, for safety, for security, and also for healthy society. Because as long as you have enemy, as long as you have people who serve in the army, people who die, and the families who struggle, it's very difficult type of society, and it's very difficult to have really sustainable peace and development without that issue and conflict, and establishing at least good neighbor relations with others around us.
Very, very, very interesting, Bella. I think I was thinking about the idea of Jai Jagat when you were speaking, because I see, after working in India for many years, civil society in India is very, very vibrant, and many legislations in the recent past, whether it is right to information or right to work or land reforms, many of these legislations are the result of this large social movements in India. So I was also involved in many movements related to the indigenous people and poor people and their rights over land and livelihood resources, because we believe that centralized economy is a violent model. And in a country like India, unless you have a decentralized economy where people can really take control of their own life, and that is why Gandhi was always speaking about self-sufficient, self-governed village system rather than a centralized government trying to control everybody. So I was part of many social movements, like back in 2000, thousands of us were walking for 6 months, covering a distance of 3,500 kilometers, mobilizing people in a big way. Then in 2007, we took 25,000 people marching all the way to Delhi, to the capital. In 2012, about 100,000 people marched to Delhi. All that demanding a different model of development. And we were using non-violence in a very, very powerful way to build these movements, so that young people get trained and they understand how to lead a non-violent movement and not to get into provocations and get into violence. And based on this experience of many years, we traveled through Latin American countries and African countries to see how the civil society is active in those countries. And that is where we got this idea of Jai Jagat. In fact, Jai Jagat means victory of the world. Let us forget about victory of India and victory of Pakistan, victory of Bangladesh and Armenia. Let us speak about victory of the world. And we meant by that, see, in a globalizing world, no country is going to win unless we care for the planet as a whole. And Jai Jagat was built around that. How do you get this civil society to act, not only nationally, but globally? Because we found, as we were traveling, we found poverty was increasing in every part of the world. Water was getting polluted. Forests were burning in different parts of the world. Uncontrolled greed is destroying the resources, and competition to become the richest and getting their name published was going on in every part of the world. And weapon is piling up, and when weapons are piling up, you need to have a war. So we thought it is time for us to support the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, and though they are speaking about 17 goals, we got a gist of it. And we said, okay, poverty need to end, because poverty is one form of violence and that need to end. Inequality need to end, because this 1% people controlling 58% of global wealth is not something acceptable. Violence need to end, because in the name of violence, millions and millions of dollars are spent in this arms race. And violence also need to end. All forms of violence need to end. But we thought we are too small to have, how can, this is a big agenda, and some civil society organization in India jumping up is not going to make a lot of difference. We said, okay, let us walk through the world, part of the world. Let us take the pains on our body to draw the attention of people. Let us walk through 11 countries. Let us walk for an year. And that is how Jai Jagat was put together to some extent, okay, do a bit of sacrifice so that you are able to draw the attention of the world. Now, to our surprise, though it is a bad news of COVID-19, what Jai Jagat couldn't do, COVID could do in one day, right? It's like it has become so loud and clear that this form of development is not going to work. This form of economy is not going to work. We need to reorganize the world in a different way. So I think this is a wake-up call. And how, while you work for Armenia, I work for India, and many of our civil society actors who are listening today will also be working for their own country, is there a possibility that we all come together? This planet is in crisis, and COVID has suddenly opened an awareness among people that, look, something has really gone wrong, and we need to really change the way we act. Like Gandhi said, live simple so that others can simply live. So how do we reorganize our life and our development model, our economic model, is a big question. And I thought probably you have a take on that, because you think about those issues and you work around those issues. And while you are practicing it in Armenia, probably you must have thought about how do we now use this opportunity to build something global. As soon as we get an opportunity, how do we all come together and say, no more business as usual, change it? So how do we get that energy pulled together to change the situation? Any take on that, Bella?
Well, I think I was really enjoying what you were saying. I think it's something, a bit of elephant in the room, not only of days of this COVID-19, but for a longer time, when we have big humanitarian crisis, or we have war, places like Iraq, or we have Amazon forests or indigenous people living in there, and how we as global citizens can participate, and how we can influence the decision makers, not only on local but also on global levels. I think one of the thinkers, Mary Calder, I just shared the post in our chat, the book which called Global Civil Society. So I think this notion exists, that different solidarity groups from all parts of the world, how we can get together also to stop wars. And they were and they are certain movements. I know that, for example, there is a strong women for movement for women, peace and security, a global movement for more engagement of women in decision making on local, regional, and global levels. I think there are other groups, like environmental groups, which try to go together and work together. There are also civic liberties groups that I personally engage with lots of groups from OSCE region, including countries like Ukraine and Russia and Georgia. I believe that this solidarity spirit, talking to each other, having more of sharing like this, is very, very useful. There's also, I will share the link, there's very useful handbook called New Tactics, where people share tactics from their civic movements from different countries, and platform where we can learn from each other. I do understand this is not probably the precise answer to your question, because I don't think I have any, but my experience shows that getting together, talking to each other, thinking around big ideas of changing the world is always useful. I participated in social forum in Paris. I think it was 2000, maybe 4 or 6. So it was a huge Paris social forum where you could see all sorts of people with all sorts of causes coming together and marching on the streets of Paris. And there are social forums taking place in other parts of the world. So I think this is one of the strong networks that people try to pursue a common goal of keeping governments accountable and changing. And I believe in the long run, we do influence the policies. Maybe in a short run, we feel that we are not always successful or we have just small victories. But in a long run, I believe there are very important success stories that we see, including in climate change, at least in the European Union, that there are some important resolutions taken and some measures. Not all countries follow it, but to a certain extent, we can see global labor movements, including Armenia, changing towards the good labor codes and respecting labor rights. So I believe it's there, and it's very important, this international solidarity, and that's why I'm so happy that we are talking, 4 of us, and now we have also 18 people from different parts of the world who follow us. I think this is one of the examples how we just share and exchange. And just in the end, I wanted to say that it's not that I know a lot about India, just bits and pieces, but I remember from my university years that I had this fabulous piece from Amartya Sen about democracy and famine, that the relations between that. So I know that India has lots of problems with population and lots of it, just because it's huge and so multicultural. But at the end of the day, what's important for me, that India has pretty strong judiciary and courts, something that ensures lots of checks and balances within the state. And this is something that Armenia unfortunately strongly misses, and I believe David will confirm that in this particular point in time we are struggling. Just if we compare with India, we had very different development paradigms. So you have these basic democratic things and then lots of party and lots of other structural causes, while in Armenia the population, I think polarization is not as great as in India. It's very more or less homogeneous society, small. But here we lack this very basic democracy traditions that India has, at least for last, I don't know, 200 years, maybe less, but lots of it. I mean, the courts, and I remember the big fight between the constitutional court and the local governance, etc., etc. So I think what we can learn from you, that the country can be poor, but at the same time, I know that India is not poor at all. Now it's one of these growing economies, but people can be poor, but still the foundations of democracy, such as independent judiciary, can provide a lot of sustainability for the society. Something that Armenia has long way to go.
Well, Bella, something I wanted to tell you, because I know that you are involved not only in Armenia, but you are trying to bring about a kind of a regional dynamics of peace. You know, it's like you said in the initial statement, you are a landlocked country with good friendly states and not so good friendly states, etc. So this is something that we need to share, because the kind of efforts that you make are the kind of efforts that we make in South Asia. You know, it's like India, with all the descriptions you made, we always create an enemy out of Pakistan. You know, so we need to spend quite a lot of money, not in dealing with poverty and problems for the people, but in terms of building the army at the border. So the amount of money spent in building armies quite huge. And then the civil society is very, very concerned about it. So we want a South Asian dynamics, like you want a Caucasian dynamics. We are trying to have a South Asian dynamics, because unless the South Asians come together, the problems cannot be solved. Because you have a country like Bangladesh, which is highly populated. And if we all cross our borders to them, there is no place for them to go, right? So how do you create a regional dynamics and a peaceful region, so that we can, rather than spending our time into these regional fights, we are able to focus on global issues. Interestingly, we have a process called SAARC, South Asia, South Asia Association for Regional Cooperation.
Yes, yes.
But we also have a parallel People's SAARC, right? So we are trying to have peoples to people relationship built. You cannot wait for state to build relationship and then finally people follow. People will have to take initiative, which the state should follow, whether it is development model or friendship building. So in the last some years, we were also working around an organization called SAPA, South Asia Partners Alliance, South Asia Peace Alliance, and through which we were trying to train young people in every country, so that these young people will have a different mindset. They will think about the other country not as enemies, but as friends. I remember when we did a training program in Batumi some years back, we had participants from the region, and then initially they were all frightened about the other guy. But by the end of the training program, they were all such good friends, So how do you create a new feeling in the minds of young people from this enemy theory to wanting to be together to solve problems? And then we should also have civil societies coming together. And we are also trying to do some kind of a planning for South Asia and South Asian March, so that we can go to Sri Lanka, we can go to Nepal, we can go to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And as a result, we were able to get one delegation of Jai Jagat to go to Pakistan, and they came back very, very excited. So the point that I'm trying to drive at is that, can we think of surviving together, especially after this COVID incident? How do we come together as civil society within the region and then globally? And we need to think of a dynamics through which we can build national civil society, then the regional civil society dynamics, and global civil society dynamics, like you said, the global forums that are there. So that is something about which in the coming days we will have to work together. Now probably we have our moderators wanting to say something before we go ahead. Yeah.
I just wanted to say that kind of simultaneously in the chat, I'm trying to post different links from what I know, including this GPAC network that I'm also part of, which is a global partnership for prevention of armed conflicts. So I shared also South Asia link when you see different partners, including women groups working for peace. So. And I also see our friend Bernard, who I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, joining us. So bonjour, and that's it from my side.
Can you just use this opportunity to elaborate about your study on roots of violence? You were involved in a study on roots of violence, and then where are you at?
Well, in fact, there were other people who did the study, and it's in the process, and we were looking into a very kind of Armenian case. What we could see that, for example, Soviet Union, not Soviet Union per se, but certain practices, especially Stalin era gulags, created very specific subculture called blood noise subculture, or semi-criminal. I don't even know the language, how to translate it into English or other languages, but it created this type of gulag, closed institutions culture, which then went out from the prison, because gulags were the huge prison all over the Soviet Union. And lots of people were in gulags, including people from Armenia. So when they came back, a lot of this blatno culture, very violent prison type of culture, then infiltrated into the day-to-day culture also of Armenian people. And this is true not only for Armenia, but for many post-Soviet countries, if I look into in a nutshell. But answering your question, I think it's so important also to develop, I know this is a little bit of hula baloo and cliche word, but some sort of critical thinking. Why we think these people are our enemies? What are the roots? What we know about our neighbors? Why do we think that we're good and they're bad? So what we do with as a part of Eurasia Partnership Foundation, we do a lot of dismantling of stereotypes about the other, and we try to be critical about ourselves, our own history, our own perceptions, our own thinking, why we are so exceptionally good and why some others are so exceptionally bad, and what are the roots of it. So usually it's not easy process, because you need to dismantle your own knowledge about who you are and your own identity things, and then build it back with a really long reading and reflecting and thinking, and then it helps. Because personally I don't believe in the short-term interventions, that because people get together, they party, they are young, it's fine, and then they'll go back to their history textbooks, which are often false. They come back to their societal stereotypes about the others without knowing anything about the others, or without even not seeing them tete-a-tete, like in person. So to me, I had this very good experience with Bernard and the others since I was 17, when I could go out and participate in all different type of exchanges and see other people. So I believe it's so important for young people from Armenia, from the region, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Kashmir, from everywhere, to go and see each other, to have this people-to-people contact. Sometimes it's very painful, because you need to get rid of very dear to your heart stereotypes that you have about the other. But I believe this is the way to go. You start from yourself and your own problems and your own cliches, and this is how we can change big things, if we really, really do it, try it with ourselves and our society.
Since we only have about 5 minutes left,
okay.
and since there haven't been many questions, I wanted to make 4 observations of the similarities and differences of what you two have spoken. I think on the question of the Armenian Revolution, Bela, David, correct me if I'm wrong, this was really an indigenous revolution. It was not from geopolitical forces from which it started, it was from the Armenian people. And I think similarly, the same was in India, that the freedom struggle really came from the people itself. And I think that genuine indigenous, if I could call it, revolution was significant in what shapes the future after the revolution. Both in India, where we went on and had the various developments that Rajgopal spoke about, and where Armenia is today. A second observation which you made, Bela, which I found extremely interesting, was you said that the difficulty, of course, is the centralization of power that tends to happen in politics after any given revolution where there's massive people's participation. And the real issue of civil society is how do you decenter that centralization to enable continued people's participation. And this has happened in India as well, where civil society has talked a lot about decentralization and going down to local administration and local government. But what I wanted to draw your attention to is we walked for 1 month through much of Armenia, through villages, through towns, through cities. And we saw the beginnings of civil society connecting to rural development. And I think that rather than civil society being a middle class group of people who are mostly urban based, the hope we have in Armenia is to see connections that are being made to rural societies. And picking up on what Rajgopal said, that one has to help the most marginalized and poor, which are often that 30% poor in Armenia are often in the rural areas. What we also saw in rural Armenia was a bleeding of young people out of rural areas into the cities, and the unwillingness to come back after one's university education, and where we saw schools enrollment in villages go down. So the second point is really how in civil society's role of making the government accountable, how important decentralization is. I think that was a second very significant point. The third I found very interesting was this whole notion of regionalism. Of course, what you have in the South Caucasus and what Euro-Asia Partnership is doing in doing exchanges, links, joint research across the region, which includes the difficulties of a long-time war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and using Georgia also to mediate in that process. I think it's really amazing that what you've talked about in your roots of violence is to get down to the base perceptions of people of the other, and how do we change that? Similarly, in India and Pakistan, we have within South Asia, India's relationship with Pakistan is really similar, that people find it very hard to rise above their narrow partisanship, to see the other. And we look to South Caucasus for giving us more ideas and more understanding how to do that. In your research, I hope that we can hear more from you on it from Euro-Asia Partnership later. So my third point is really drawing attention to the regional conflicts, which we both share in the South Caucasus and South Asia. And the final point, if I may just quickly finish, is the global solidarity that you spoke of. Your first trip to the World Social Forum in Paris in 2006 as a young person, understanding that other people are interested in coming together into some sort of global civil society. I think in this age of coronavirus, we are more aware than ever that if we don't build global solidarity, we are going to be in a big mess, because planetary issues like the coronavirus or like climate change require a global response. And how do you do that without a global solidarity? And who better than civil society to come together and do that? So I want to thank you and all of the Armenians for joining in the Jai Jagat as an effort, as one small effort to build that global solidarity. And I encourage all of us to continue to do more in future. But before we conclude, maybe I could just ask David to say a few words before we end.
I just want to thank our speakers for this thorough speech. It was really very interesting, very informative. I think for the people who are interested in such topics as civil society and all the things which we talked about, it was really, there was a very big information, and even Bella provided us with some links of the books. I was caught with them 1-2 minutes. I was reading the books which brought after it. So what I wanted to mention, which I think is very important, is that in Armenia, especially in Armenia and also in the countries where democratic institutions are not very stable and strong, the role of civil societies is really very important to watchdog the government, to be attentive with the problem, people's problem. And now our experience shows that no matter how legitimate is the government, it's very important always to voice up the problems, to keep the agenda, which was very actual after the revolution, and to work as much as we can. Second, what I wanted to mention when we spoke about regional conflicts and this nationalistic propaganda, it appears when civil society is not strong, when there's, I think, in my opinion, when the government has not is not very concerned about democratic changes. And this is a very good topic to speak, because with this you can fulfill agendas, you can fulfill topics, and sometimes for people they use like baits such policies. So in our case, and as in worldwide case, when democratic institutions are stronger, the possibility of nationalistic propaganda is lower. So I think these parts were really important for me. And I would like that if we have more time, we went deeper in the, as Bella mentioned, our revolution had different attributes, and there were a lot of factors which resulted in the revolution. We can even divide them into two parts, like subjective reasons and objective reasons. I think we will still have time to go into these subjective ones, which are really important for Armenian revolution, because like the objective part, as Bella has already mentioned, it was more connected with this Republican Party behavior, and the comparison with the USSR, really, it was really very like illustrative. So that's it. I think our discussion was really very successful, and I want to thank our speakers and the people who were listening us.
Thank you. Thank you.
If I may,
thank you, Bella. Thank you, David.
I just want to say thank you very much.
Yeah.
Also for everyone who were watching us. Hopefully this is not going to be the last thing.
No,
also,
no.
personally, I should thank everyone, because we are all learning through these processes. So thanks so much for following, and hopefully we shall be in touch.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Jai Jagat. Jai Jagat.
Jai Jagat.